The independent autopsy results for 18-year-old Nolan Wells have just been released, and the very first detail in that report is already sending shockwaves through his family and across the country. Because before any conclusion was offered, before any cause of death was discussed, before any of the deeper forensic findings were even addressed, the pathologist opened his written report with something no parent should ever have to read about their own child. A piece of evidence that should have been there, that under ordinary circumstances would have been there, simply was not. Something was missing from the moment the examination began, and it was the very first thing the examiner felt compelled to note. For a family already living inside 6 weeks of unanswered questions, that opening line changed everything. What follows tonight is the full picture of what that report actually says, what it does not say, and why the distinction between those two things may be the most important detail in this entire case. Before we go any further, there are a few things you need to understand about what we are going to walk through together. First, the unexplained mark found at the back of Nolan's head, a finding that the independent pathologist flagged as significant enough to warrant further investigation. Second, the official classification that his examiner ultimately reached, and why a single word in that classification carries more weight than most people realize. Third, the question that still sits beneath every other question in this case, the one that investigators themselves have indicated may matter more than any physical finding recovered afterward. And finally, the three specific gaps in the evidence that, as of tonight, are the only things standing between this family and the truth they have been asking for since the very first day. We want to be honest with you about what this story is. This is a real, ongoing case. It is still active, still unresolved, and some of what we are about to cover carries genuine emotional weight. A young man is gone, a family is still grieving. Everything we discuss tonight comes directly from official reporting and public statements. Nothing more, nothing embellished. If this is not the kind of story you came here for tonight, that is completely understandable. No judgment at all. But we wanted you to know exactly what you were stepping into before we continued. To understand why that first missing detail matters as much as it does, you have to understand exactly what led Nolan's family to demand a second examination in the first place, and what that decision actually cost them. Because it cost them far more than money or time. It cost them something that can never be given back. On July the 6th, a park ranger moving along the edge of the island discovered Nolan's body in the water. Within hours, before toxicology, before a completed timeline, before nearly anything had actually been established, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter stood in front of reporters and offered the public an early explanation. He described it, in essence, as an accident. Nothing, he suggested, to indicate otherwise. That is the moment this case truly began, even before anyone realized it. Because for Nolan's mother, Christine, and his father, Elmore, that early explanation did not feel like reassurance. It felt like a door closing on their son's story before it had ever really been opened. It felt like being told, gently but firmly, that there was nothing more to ask, nothing more to look for, nothing more to fight for. They did not accept that. 6 days after Nolan disappeared, his family made a decision that would ultimately reshape this entire case. They chose not to simply wait on local officials to finish their work. They chose not to quietly accept the account they had already been given. Instead, in the middle of the most painful days of their lives, while trying to plan a funeral for their son, they made arrangements to have his body examined again. Not because they were chasing a different answer, because they needed a complete one. Sit with that decision for a moment, because it is easy to hear it as a simple procedural choice, and it was anything but. This is a family making an active decision to delay saying goodbye, to prolong an already unbearable process, because something inside them refused to accept an explanation that arrived faster than the truth ever could have. That takes a particular kind of resolve, the kind that only grief and love combined can produce. The person they chose for that second examination was Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist with more than 20 years of experience. A man who had once served as chief medical examiner for an entire major American city, overseeing thousands of cases long before this one ever reached his table. He had no ties to Mississippi, no relationship with any of the officials involved, nothing to gain by leaning in any particular direction. His task was not to confirm what the family suspected, and it was not to confirm what officials had already said publicly, either. His task was simply to examine what remained and report only what the evidence in front of him could genuinely support. What he found did not offer the family the closure they may have quietly hoped for. It handed them something far more complicated, a case that refused entirely to close. And right there, at the very opening of his written findings, was the detail that has now become the center of this entire story. Before Dr. Mitchell could even begin his own examination, he noted that certain evidence expected to arrive with Nolan's body simply had not. Material that should have been present, that is present under ordinary circumstances during any thorough second examination, was missing entirely. It had never been sent. According to the report, that material had been retained during the very first examination, the one conducted by the state before Nolan's body was ever released back to his family. Dr. Mitchell, drawing on his own decades of experience in this exact kind of forensic work, noted that this type of retention is not unheard of. It happens in many cases. It is considered standard, nothing more than routine procedure, while an initial examiner completes further review. But knowing why something might be missing does not undo the fact that it is missing. And its absence, right there at the outset of the report, meant that an entire category of critical questions could not be examined at all. Not because Dr. Mitchell lacked the skill or the diligence to look, because there was simply nothing left in front of him to look at. For a family who had already endured so much, discovering that this very first, most basic piece of the puzzle was unavailable to them felt like being denied something they were entitled to from the beginning. Not out of malice, necessarily, but the effect was the same either way. A gap where an answer should have been. That single missing piece opened the door to everything else the report would go on to reveal. Because once that gap was acknowledged, Dr. Mitchell's official classification followed, and it carried its own weight entirely. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. It is worth pausing on that word, because it is easy to let it slide past without truly absorbing what it means. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean there is nothing left to find. It means that as of this examination, there was not yet enough information available to say with real certainty what took place in Nolan's final hours. For a family who had already been told, within a single hour of their son being found, that this looked like a simple accident, that one word carried enormous significance. It was the first official acknowledgement that the story the public had been handed was not the whole story. It quietly reopened a door that had been closed before anyone had truly had the chance to look inside. Then came a second finding, one that no one in that room was fully prepared to hear. During his examination, Dr. Mitchell identified an area at the back of Nolan's head that he could not explain. There was no fracture beneath it, nothing that pointed clearly toward an accident, and nothing that pointed clearly toward anything else. Simply a mark with no obvious origin. The kind of detail a careful, experienced pathologist cannot dismiss and cannot fully explain either. In his own written report, Dr. Mitchell chose his language with visible restraint. He did not call it evidence of harm. He did not call it proof of anything at all. What he did say was that it was significant enough to be highlighted for further investigation. A careful, deliberate phrase from a man who had spent an entire career learning exactly how much and how little a body left behind can honestly tell you. For a case already shadowed by unanswered questions, even a cautious finding like this one was enough to shift the entire national conversation. Because for the first time since Nolan disappeared, there was something concrete, something documented in writing by a credentialed, independent expert, something that could no longer be waved away as speculation or rumor or grief, searching desperately for somewhere to place itself. 3 separate findings, taken together, told a story that no early press conference had prepared the public for. An official classification that offered no closure. A missing piece of evidence that closed off entire lines of inquiry before they could even begin. And an unexplained mark that no one, not even the most experienced pathologist in the room, could confidently account for. Now, to understand why this case grew from a local tragedy into a story followed by people across the entire country, we have to go back once more to those very first hours after Nolan was found. Because what was said in that early window, before any real investigation had even begun, is where so much of this family's distrust was first planted, and where it has continued to grow ever since. Some of the details from that day have never sat right, no matter how many times they have been examined. Nolan had gone out onto the water that morning with a group of friends. By every account given afterward, he did not return with them, and neither did his phone. The explanation offered was that he had chosen to stay behind a little longer, to spend more time on the island before eventually finding his own way back to shore. But that explanation left behind a question that has never been fully answered. If an 18-year-old was simply staying behind for a while, why would he leave without the one device capable of keeping him connected to the people who loved him? Why walk away from the very thing that could tell his family exactly where he was, exactly who he was with, exactly what was happening around him in case anything ever went wrong? It is a small detail on the surface, but in cases like this one, it is so often the smallest details where the real story quietly waits to be noticed. For Nolan's mother, Christine, these were precisely the kinds of questions she wanted asked and genuinely answered before anyone attached a final explanation to what happened to her son. Instead, by her own account, she found herself face to face with a conclusion that already felt settled, arriving before she had even been given the space to process her own loss, let alone begin the unbearable task of planning her son's funeral. In her own words, spoken publicly weeks later, she asked investigators for just one thing. "Treat this case," she said, "the way you would treat it if it were your own child. Give it the same urgency, the same scrutiny, the same refusal to look away simply because, from the outside, the story seemed easy enough to explain." There is something almost unbearable about a mother having to ask for that, having to publicly request that her son's death be taken seriously, having to advocate loudly and repeatedly while still in the earliest, rawest stages of grief, simply to be heard by the people whose job it was to help her. That request, a mother asking plainly and painfully to be believed, is ultimately what helped carry this story onto a national stage. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People stood beside the family at their national convention. NAACP President Derek Johnson addressed the moment directly, in front of a room full of people who had gathered specifically to hear it. He spoke to a pattern, he said, that the organization has witnessed far too many times, across far too many years. Cases involving young Black lives, he said, are too often allowed to close before they are properly opened. The narrative settled before all the facts have even been gathered, before every witness has been questioned, before every possibility has been genuinely explored. And this case, painfully, does not stand alone. It is now the third time in recent months that a young Black man has died while spending time among an otherwise white group of friends, only for the very first version of events, the one offered within hours or even minutes of the discovery, to later fall apart under closer scrutiny. Each of these cases carries its own specific circumstances, its own grieving family left behind to pick up the pieces. But the pattern connecting them has become impossible for many people to ignore. And it is exactly why so many people following Nolan's case are not only asking what happened to him specifically, they are asking a harder, more uncomfortable question that extends far beyond this one family. Why does the earliest explanation, again and again, so often seem to arrive faster than the investigation that should have come before it? For Nolan's family, none of this has ever been about assuming guilt before proof exists. Attorney Ben Crump, representing them, has been careful to draw that exact distinction publicly, more than once, in more than one setting. They are not asking for a predetermined outcome. They are not asking for anyone to be presumed responsible without real evidence to support it. What they are asking for is, in truth, far simpler than that, and far harder for anyone to reasonably argue against. A full, fair, and transparent investigation. One where every witness is questioned with equal seriousness, regardless of who they are or who they might know. One where every piece of evidence, no matter how small it might initially seem, is followed all the way through to its conclusion. And one where no final answer is written down until the facts themselves are genuinely ready to support it. That is the entire ask. Not a rushed verdict offered for the sake of convenience or closure. Not assumptions quietly dressed up as answers. Just the truth, pursued all the way through, with the same care and patience any family would want extended to their own child. Even now, after everything we have walked through together tonight, this case still rests on a foundation with real, significant gaps in it. And it feels important to be honest about exactly what those gaps are, because they are the reason nothing here can truthfully be called finished. And they are the reason this story continues to weigh so heavily on so many people who have never even met Nolan or his family. The first gap is toxicology. As of tonight, no toxicology results have been made public, not from the family's independent examination and not from the state of Mississippi. That absence matters more than it might initially seem. Toxicology is so often the piece of an investigation capable of either ruling a possibility out entirely or confirming exactly what a family has quietly feared from the very beginning. Without it, an entire category of questions remains suspended, unanswered, hanging in the air. Right now, outside a small circle of investigators, no one truly knows what that report will eventually reveal. And until it is finally released, this case cannot move forward the way it desperately needs to, no matter how many other details continue to surface in the meantime. The second gap belongs to the state of Mississippi itself. Long before Nolan's family ever sought a second opinion, long before his body was flown out of state for an independent review, the state's own medical examiner completed the very first examination. That was the earliest possible look at Nolan's body, closest in time to whatever happened to him that day. And to this day, those original findings have never been made public. No official report has been shared. No summary has been offered to the press. No word, publicly, on what was actually observed in those critical first hours after Nolan was found. That silence has not gone unnoticed, and it has certainly not gone unanswered. For a family already navigating an unimaginable grief, and now navigating a very public, very scrutinized investigation into their son's death, this remains one of the most frustrating, most painful unanswered questions in the entire case. Because somewhere inside a file that has not yet been opened to the public may sit the very details capable of finally answering what the second, independent examination, through no fault of its own, simply could not. And then there is the third gap, the one that sits underneath every other question in this case. The one that, more than any other single detail uncovered so far, could ultimately change the entire understanding of what took place on that day. What condition was Nolan actually in the moment he entered the water? Was he fully aware of what was happening around him? Was he not? Investigators have indicated, in their own careful language, that this single detail may be the most important piece of the entire case, more significant, in some very real sense, than any individual physical finding recovered afterward, because everything else, every documented result, every unanswered question so far, ultimately circles back to this one specific moment. And right now, tonight, no one has that answer. Not the family, not their independent examiner, not the public who has spent weeks following every single update in this story, hoping each time that this might finally be the piece that brings some real clarity. Three gaps. Three reasons this case remains open. Three questions standing directly between what is known today and what actually happened to Nolan Wells on a day that was supposed to be nothing more than an ordinary summer outing with friends. So where does that leave all of us? After everything we have covered together tonight, it leaves us right back where this story began. Cause and manner of death, undetermined. Not because nothing was found, not because no one is looking, or trying, or asking the right questions, but because there is still, even now, too much missing to say with any real certainty exactly what happened on that day. This is not the end of Nolan's story. At best, tonight is the midpoint. And if there is one thing this case has proven so far, one lesson that keeps quietly repeating itself, it is that the full truth rarely arrives all at once. It tends to come in pieces, released slowly, sometimes reluctantly, often only after enough attention, enough pressure, and enough people simply refusing to look away has made it impossible for that truth to remain buried any longer. Behind every one of these unanswered questions is a family who has to keep living every single day inside the space those questions leave behind. A mother who wakes up each morning still without the answer she has been asking for since the very beginning. A father carrying a grief that the rest of the world only glimpses in brief moments, in press conferences, in short public statements, while the quiet, private weight of it never actually leaves him. And a young man, only 18 years old, whose story is still being written by other people simply because he is no longer here to finish telling it himself. That is what makes this case matter far beyond the headlines, far beyond the updates, far beyond the attention it has drawn from across the entire country. It was never simply about what happened on one afternoon in July. It has always been about whether a family is finally given the full, complete truth they have been asking for since the very first day, or whether they are left indefinitely inside the same uncertainty that has followed them since the moment they first heard that single word. Undetermined. We intend to be here for every piece of that truth as it comes. The moment toxicology becomes public, we will be back with the details, examined with the same care we have applied throughout this entire case, without jumping ahead of what the evidence actually shows. and without adding anything beyond what has genuinely been confirmed. If you would rather hear that update here, carefully and accurately, rather than from someone else's rushed recap somewhere else, make sure you are subscribed right now before you move on to whatever comes next in your evening. And before you go tonight, we want to hear directly from you. Out of everything laid out across this case, which detail stood out to you the most? Was it that very first missing piece of evidence, noted before the examination had even truly begun? Was it the timeline from that original day on the island? Was it something said in her own words by Nolan's mother? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one, and more often than you might expect, it is your comments that end up shaping exactly where we take this story next. Until the next confirmed update, we will see you back here.